Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey guys, it's Scott Groves on the On the Edge podcast, and I'm interviewing my new friend. We actually met just a couple months ago, Nicole Jansen, and she is what I would call a transformational leadership coach. She has a company called Leaders of Transformation, and this podcast is going to be a lot more business, kind of how to think, not what to think, not as much fact checking. But Nicole is an awesome leader of people who want to lead, and so we're going to have that conversation instead of being overtly political. So Nicole, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me here, Scott. It'll be fun.
So I kind of want to hear, you and I, based on our gray hair, have a few more years under our belt. And I think it's kind of funny when you're scrolling through Instagram and you see the, 22-year-old life coach or the 23-year-old business coach that hasn't grown anything except for selling $99 business coaching programs. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey, your background, your professional experience that leads somebody to be like, you know what, I really want to help transform leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you say that because, even if it's not a $99 program, it's a $10,000 program and they made a quick success, I think it's fantastic. I think that God bless them for that. And you and I both know that life is just getting started. So yeah, for me, I actually had that vision when I was 16 years old. I started my own business. By then I was already working in my family's business. And I thought, you know what, by 21, I'm gonna have this thing wrapped up, be financially independent and never have to work another day in my life, blah, 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 and so forth. Of course, it didn't exactly work that way. I did create success. My parents, I started to work more and more in their business as it just really exploded. And we were international in several countries and so forth. And it was great. And actually by my mid 20s, we had built an 8-figure business. That's back in the 90s. So it's worth a lot more now, but it was fun. And I thought that's what I was going to do. I thought, okay, well, great. We worked really hard, made it, done and done. And, but I guess God had other plans because that business ended up falling apart. And I say God, but really, part of the reason why I'm so passionate about leadership today is because part of the demise of that business was the lack of great leaders. And
which is weird to say because it was your parents' business, right?
Well, it's not just my parents. My parents were great. At the same time, one of the things that they were loyal to a fault. We were in business with some people that had other motives, let's just say, right. Greed, self-interest. When you add a few zeros on it, it starts to get a little sketchy.
Right.
Money doesn't change people, it reveals people. And so the greed and the ego, the egotism and all of that really played into it. And my parents were like, it'll be fine. Everything's going to work out fine. I'm like, this ain't going to go fine. This is, I just knew that it was not going to go well. Anyways, that whole business fell apart and we lost everything and had to start over again. At that point, I was like, okay, well, first of all, I had my pity party, let's be honest. Okay. Yeah. And then after that, I looked at it and was like, okay, well, what did I learn from this? What can I extract from this to use going forward? I put all my eggs ultimately in that basket, if you will, and was really focused on the business. And here it's all the eggs cracked, right? So I'm looking at it and going, okay, what can I do? So I learned a lot. I learned a lot on the way up, and I learned even more on the way down. And then what I did is I started a company called Discover the Edge, and I extracted from all of that, realized that business is all about people. And you need to understand people. You need to understand how people operate. That's where the human behavior aspect came in, and things that I had been using for years to be able to navigate, work with, CEOs of companies and people that, back shipping dock, whatever the contrast, like that whole contrast of working with different people. The tools that I was using for that, I thought would be very, very valuable to teach. So I started teaching that. But as I was going into companies and working with them, I realized it was not just that, there was a lot of other things going on. And so I started to expand that. They started asking me, can you coach me? And at first I was like, no, I'm not a coach. I'm not your therapist. No, it's, I'm results driven, and after a while, I finally said, okay, well, let's give it a go. And then realized I'd been coaching I've really been doing that for years and
Right.
years and just didn't call it that. So that's kind of how I got into that space. And then, but as I got further into it, I started realizing some other things. It wasn't just about business, it's about people and understanding people. It really is beyond that. It gets into the principles of leadership and what does it take to be a great leader? What's the difference? And right now I believe that we are in the midst of a leadership crisis. In fact, that was about 10, 15 years ago. I was talking to somebody who's an executive recruiter in Toronto, where I'm originally from, and Dave, and he said at that time, he said, I am seeing a leadership gap because the older leaders are retiring and the younger leaders are actually not being trained and equipped. And so he was seeing it actually in the talent pool. But I think even beyond that, we're even the leaders we do have in place,
Right.
That there is a leadership crisis where there's a lot of greed, there's a lot of self-interest, a lot of things that I saw back in the day, I'm seeing now on a much larger scale. And so I started the podcast back in 2015, Leaders of Transformation, and it's been great. Had the opportunity to interview 393 so far as of today, different people talking about transformation, talking about leadership, and just seeing the commonalities of what it takes to be a great leader. And so that's kind of where the passion came from, as I experienced it firsthand. And have had the privilege of having adversity in many different areas: business, finances, and relationship, health. And every time you get to learn from it. So all of that kind of prepared me for what I do, because now, especially with the world or how crazy it is, I can be that calm in the midst of the storm and help people navigate through that and make wise decisions, not based on emotion and fear and what's going on out there, but really getting grounded and making the right decisions for themselves, for their company and family and all of that.
You said like 4 things there that I underlined, and I was taking notes as you were talking. And the first one I want to go back to, because it's like kind of part of your origin story. I don't think that we can overstate the scar tissue that is left when you're in your 20s and have a massive failure, because much like you said, your identity was wrapped up from the time you were 16 to 25 in your business. I kind of had the same experience where, like, in my 20s, I wasn't just Scott. I wasn't just Scott, the home loan person. I was Scott, the home loan person that worked at Washington Mutual. And when that bank failed, it was the biggest bank failure in history, and I was just a small cog in the wheel. It really screwed with me. Like, hey, did I make the wrong life decisions? Did I pick the wrong company? Should I have gone to Citibank? Am I worth anything? Like, where is my career going? And so maybe can you talk a little bit, because obviously we have a whole generation now of kids that are dealing with some emotional turmoil of the last couple of years. Can you talk a little bit about that scar tissue or getting over those massive failures that maybe we have in our teenage years or our 20 years? Because I have to imagine that shaped a huge part of who you are, as it still has like some, I always say that I have some WAMU post-traumatic stress syndrome. We used to all be in a Facebook group together. There was like 50,000 ex-WAMU employees there, but then somebody shut it down. And I was like, yeah, this is like our little PTSD group for those that worked at Washington Mutual and saw their whole 401k go up in smoke. So can you talk about that? It facing those kind of big adversities, the big adversity young earlier in your life?
Oh yeah, 100%. And for me, it also imprinted as scars, as you call it, because it was my parents as well. So not only did I lose everything, my parents lost everything. And I saw the heartbreak of people that they were loyal to, that they poured their heart, blood, sweat, and tears into, and those people turning on them and not standing with them, leaving them out to dry. And so I saw the heartbreak in them. And so absolutely did it imprint on me. I had to do a lot of inner work in healing to separate myself from the experience. And so we have a hard time often to do that. Okay. So we are, if you will, the sum total of our life experience, right? That's the lens in which we see the world. And that is actually not just the lens, but oftentimes it becomes who we are. I talk about, recently, I've been talking a lot more about identity and knowing your identity and differentiating your identity from the accolades, the accomplishments, even the archetypes. Like I teach, DISC, and I use some different tools to help people understand themselves and others better, build better relationships, more effective teams. All of that's great. But if you make it your identity in sense, then you're limiting yourself, right? You're limiting the possibility of who you really are and who you can be. And so, adversity is another thing, right? So yeah, people get defined by their accomplishments. Like, I was this,
Right.
and now what am I without that? Or I had these things, I had this big house and the car and the wife and the whatever and all of that stuff. And now it's all gone. What do I do with that? Or I'm young and I was beautiful and in demand in Hollywood and all that. Now who am I when I'm older? And so when we assign our identity to those external things, we set ourselves up to fail because those things are temporary, right? So I needed to differentiate that and going, wow, I am a spiritual being having a human experience. The spiritual being's okay. Here I am. I'm made in God's image. God is love, pure potential. So that's me. This is an experience, right? This is what other people are saying about me. That's all outside of me. It's not me. And so making that difference was really important for me. And then what I did is I actually dove into who am I? Like, really, my strengths, my passion, yes, experience as well. But even just the more than that is like, who am I without all of this? And then when I put those things and add those things on, they're kind of like bonuses, right? It's like, great, I get to play in this arena and I get to experience this accomplishment or receive these accolades. Cool. But I'm not those things. And so, as I said, even with relationships, I was married once, right? And now divorced. So if my identity was wrapped up in whatever the adversity is. So for me, I used to joke and say, like, why do I have to experience all this firsthand? Can I read this in a book? I mean, I had to experience these adversities firsthand, but it made me a good coach. But no matter what the adversity is, right now, people are experiencing, whether it's job loss, uncertainty about their health, uncertainty about their family, about their safety, whatever it is. If we don't know who we are, we can get caught up in all of that. And that's what creates the fear. Why? Because we as human beings want and desire self-preservation. Like it's innate. I don't want to die. And it feels like I'm going to die when I get challenged like this. So for me, as I said, differentiating the experience from who I am, and then looking at it and saying, how can I see this differently? So when I focused on all of the losses, I mean, look, over the last number of years, so that business, that was just one experience. It was pivotal in my life, but it was just one, right? I bought a franchise, invested a ton of money in a franchise, and that franchise system was dysfunctional and ended up shutting down. I lost my investment. I'm like, here, we're back again doing this. Like, what?
Oh, you can
again,
cuss, by the way. You can cuss on our podcast too, so feel free. I saw it almost come out.
Yeah, but like, I was like, what the heck, right? Here I am believing in what people are saying, and so forth. And then with my husband, then my parents in the last 5 years, my dad passed away suddenly 5 years ago. And then my mother 3 years ago. And then my husband, who had left, came back, and I agreed to take him back. I knew there was a risk, but take him back, and it was great until it wasn't. And then all of that. And so I've had a lot of losses in health, like we can talk about health issues and so forth. If I focus on the losses, it's going to be overwhelming. But if I look at it and say, okay, those were life experiences, things come, things go, it's temporary. What did I gain out of this? What you focus on, Tony Robbins, what you focus on expands. He talks about in his triad, change your words. If you want to change your life experience and how you experience life and your joy and your happiness, change your focus, change your words, change your state. And he talks a lot about this physiology. But if you listen deeper than that, there's a lot of talk about, what are you focusing on? Are you focusing on the negative, or are you focusing on the positive? This is not about being Pollyanna. We've got to look at the reality of what's going on around us. But what are you focusing on in that moment? Are you focusing on, oh my gosh, I'm going to die? Or, okay, I need to get through this one way or the other. How am I going to do that? And so, like I say, with this, it was like I found myself for a while, I was looking at all the losses. And honestly, my parents got stuck in the losses, and for a while. And I had to actually remind them of who they are. I had to remind them of their accomplishments. I did use it as leverage to say, look, I don't know too many people went to the White House twice for dinner and, spoke in front of 80,000 people and built a multi-million-dollar business and so forth. Immigrants, that didn't have any business experience. Like, so just building them back up again, recognizing, wow, you know what? I've got something to offer. And I actually did something with my life. It may not look like it right now, but I'm more than those experiences. I'm more than those losses. And so starting to focus on what I gained, even when my parents passed away, I started looking at it like, okay, so I just lost my dad, my mom, and my husband, and then I moved out. So, I was like, okay, what are we doing now? And I had to look at it and say, okay, well, what did I gain? Well, I gained freedom. I get to make choices. I don't have any dependents or anybody that I got to ask, for agreement on, right? I don't have to worry about my parents being, in nursing homes. That's good, even though that kind of sounds weird. But like it's just I had to look for it's a change in focus.
Yeah.
And then I had to shift my words along with it. And yes, I needed to also shift my state of physical state, my emotional state, my spiritual state, and all of that.
It's funny, and I promise this long story will come full circle. We had a friend of ours, Mike Eaton, on, who's an aspiring comedian. Well, he's doing it. He's actually in Austin making it happen. And he talks about when he watches Dave Chappelle do comedy, he's like, I don't even want to do it because he's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. And like watching him do comedy just discourages me. And what we were talking about is we were dissecting some jokes, and he said, jokes are great because they force you to change the story in your head. A joke is basically a magic trick where you think one thing's coming and then another thing's coming. And you reminded me of that joke where it's like, hey, why is divorce so expensive? Because it's worth it. And so, when you change the story, it's like a divorce is just a divorce. You can see it as a negative or you can see it as a positive. It's really just the story we assign to it. So I love the fact that some of obviously your leadership coaching is like, hey, good things are going to happen, bad things are going to happen. What is the meaning or the story that we assign to it? I heard you kind of saying that, and I think that's great. But one of the things that you said also in your opening volley, and I think we can all understand this, is just, a leadership crisis in the country, whether it's at a political level or whether it's a personal level or whether it's at a, social media level. It feels like we're in a leadership crisis where I don't care if you're on the left and you hate the right, or you're on the right and you hate the left, or I don't care if you're super progressive or super Christian conservative. It feels like everybody, in my opinion, is trying to manipulate you, not lead you. And so can you talk a little bit maybe either about the leadership crisis, or is there a tie-in here with kind of, the social media generation and stuff? What is causing, and by the way, I also realize that we have a recency bias where we see real negative stuff in the recent and we look in the past and we're like, oh, well, John F. Kennedy was such a great statesman and a leader. It's like, well, he was also philandering around and, he wasn't exactly a great human being either. But, it does feel like maybe an older generation of leader or statesmen or CEOs, they were more about the leadership and less about the manipulation. And again, maybe I'm just making that up in my head, but are these some observations that you're also seeing?
Yeah. And that's why, like what we just talked about, I know I spent some time on it, but it's kind of a setup for this, is that I think a lot of that, when you try to manipulate someone else, just think about your own life, right? When you feel like I need to manipulate somebody else, what's your motive, right? It's you want to control, right? You want it to go a certain way. But what is it saying about you when you are trying to manipulate someone else?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about my 5-year-old. When I want to manipulate him into doing something, it's just because I'm selfish and I want it done my way and I don't really care about his opinion. I just want to get back to doing whatever I was doing.
And that's like sales, right? A lot of sales manipulation in terms of like, I want the sale. How do I get them to see things my way so that I can get what I want? And it's really coming from a place of scarcity. And so it comes back to identity. Where does your identity come from? Who do you see yourself as? Because if I see myself as not enough, and I believe that as kids, we learn certain things from our childhood, even if you had a great childhood. I know people that had great childhoods and they still messed up in some ways, right? There's like this primary lie that we get, and it has to do with being not enough. Now, if a baby, you look at a brand new baby, they're born, they're cute, usually they're cute and they're cuddly, and you're just like so happy that this, they don't need to earn love, they don't need to do anything, they're just precious because they exist. But over time, that baby starts to learn that, wow, I'm not this, I'm not that. It's almost like I believe it's like this devil literally on our shoulders going, see that? See, you're not enough. You're not enough. You're not significant. You're not important. You're not loved. See, mom and dad, they divorced. That was because your fault. How many times do we hear that, right? Kids actually interpret how is it possible that a child can think that the divorce was caused by them? But a lot of kids do, right? So, or they go to school and maybe their kids, the kids at school make fun of them. What does that say? So they're making these meanings. Like you talk about the story, they're building this story, and kids are kind of like this blank slate. So they're absorbing all of this and learning a product of their own environment. So this primary lie, no matter and I think based on personality, it's going to sound different, but it's always comes down to a not enough. Now, if I believe that I'm not enough, then it's like, I will be enough if I do this. I will be enough if I get this person to like me or to love me, then I'll be enough. Right. If I have the success, comes back to those, those A's that I was talking about, right? The accolades and the accomplishments and all of that. And so what we're seeing right now is I think there's a lot of grown-up children that are having a scarcity and not enough conversation. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm enough, I don't need to control anybody. Yeah. If I'm enough, I'm not at risk when somebody says something negatively about me, because they don't define me. And I know that because I'm enough. Right. So what we're seeing right now is that's like a fundamental issue, is that there's a lot of scarcity and competing, right? Win, lose. This person says this. Well, and politics is designed that way. I had a guy on my podcast, Dr. Louis Rosenberg, and he developed some software called Unanimous AI to help make decisions. And he was talking about polls. And he says polls are actually designed to divide us because they show us how we are different, not how we're similar, right? Not how we can unify. They're actually designed they're like, well, this group says this and that group says that. What do you mean you think that way? How can you possibly think that way? You're crazy. I'm educated. I've done my research, blah, 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 blah. I'll go back and forth, right? You see all that. So, but
guilty, by the way, guilty on Facebook myself sometimes. So,
right. Well, and it's a natural thing, right? But if I look at it and I say, hey, I have a certain viewpoint, and I have a very dear friend of mine who is on the opposite side of that. Now, I can still be friends with her, and she can still be friends with me because we know who we are, right? At least I can only speak for myself, right? Is that I'm not threatened by her viewpoint, even though I don't agree with it. I'm not threatened by it, right? But if I'm not enough and I have to prove myself and I have to be validated by somebody else and what they're saying, that would make me very frustrated, right? Like, don't you get this? Come on, like I need to watch this other more. I got these doctors I want you to listen to, and and so forth, right? Because you've got to get this. Because when you get this, it means something to me. So is it important for us to find some unity, find the point of agreement? Look, sales, business, you got to find the point of agreement. So I think one of the things that we're not seeing is finding the point of agreement. I believe that, If you think about all the people in the world, even the crazies, okay, there's maybe some standing outside this, there's always those anomalies, but really everybody really wants to be loved. They want to be respected. They want to have a good life for themselves and those they care about. Now, some think that in order to do that, I've got to kill those other people so that I can have that. Right? But if we actually get to the point where we all realize we actually want the same thing, and then we can figure out the how, we might go a lot further than fighting and trying to convince and yelling across the way to the other person going, you're idiots. That doesn't, it never worked in sales for me. It doesn't work in leadership. It's not going to work in politics. It just doesn't work, right? You've got to start bringing people over, and gradually moving them. It's actually, there's a spectrum, I think it's called Spectrum of Social Activism or something like that. It was Martin Luther King who developed it. Another podcast guest talked about it and said that, you don't try to get people from the far other side to move over. What you're doing is you're having people just move gradually over. Now they're doing that right now to us. Okay. Right. That's already happening, but they're doing it for their own agenda, right? They're doing it because they want us, they have a certain, certain
desired outcome.
Desired outcome, and so, but if we actually come together and we start to see that, what if we actually all agree the fact that we all want the same thing, then we got to figure out how we do that. We might have a little bit more effective conversation, if you will. So anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
no, I love it because this leads to something we were talking about before we started recording of the first principles. And I have a really unique situation where I have a 19-year-old son, but didn't even know that he existed until he was 15. So we met for the first time when he was 15. We'd become great friends. He was out here for a month before he had to go back to college. Well, I'm glad he's going to college, but I'm bummed out he's not here anymore. And we've been having a lot of these conversations because it's interesting that I am his father, and biologically, like the whole nature versus nurture thing, he is so much like me. It's awkward. It's like, forget the nurture thing. The nature thing is like 80% of the pie. Because he walks like me. He has thoughts like I do. He complains like I do. When we're having long conversations over a cigar, he confides in me some things that is about his personality that is just like me. And so it's pretty crazy. But some of the things that I wasn't there for the first 15 years, and this 20% of what I would think would be nurture, is this idea of installing first principles in him, right? So like we were talking about a myriad of things from, Trump versus Biden to the vaccines to this, to that. And what I realize is, although he's a very smart kid and he's a very loving kid, and maybe this just comes with age and I'm being unfair, I felt that like our first principles were different, right? And so you and I were talking before we went live on the podcast, is like, I'm kind of a libertarian. I believe in personal individual liberty above all. So when it comes to the vaccine or this issue or that issue, which gets really, really emotionally charged, it's super easy to be just like, well, I always revert back to this first principle. And sometimes that's hard to defend and sometimes it's not, but like, I don't really need to get angry at you. I'll argue with you until I'm blue in the face, because like, what else are we going to do on a Tuesday afternoon? But I really don't get angry at these people, where I feel that often the people that I'm debating with, or the people that are watching on the sidelines, or the realtors that have stopped working with me because we have different political opinions, they actually dislike me, or they think I'm evil for my principles, where it's like, no, I just think you're wrong. And so I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about first principles in leaderships, or how we start to form our first principles. Because, you mentioned when you have principles, it makes all the business decisions easy. It makes all the leadership decisions easy. So how do people form our principles? Is it like, are we born with it? Is it 2 to 5 years old, 15 to 25 years old? Like, what happens with that talking point of principles, as you said, before we went live?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, you mentioned, he's got your DNA. So he's going to have a certain way of thinking. Absolutely. But this nurture piece is really important, because we are a product of our environment. So I may have had natural inclinations to be an entrepreneur, but it helped that my parents were entrepreneurs and had businesses. And so, and they thought a certain way, and they were immigrants. And so they brought us up the way that they were used to being brought up. And so there are certain principles that they installed in us. Responsibility was one, that if we go down that that rabbit hole, responsibility, a lot of it has been taken off the table for this last generation. I'm not stereotyping all, but a lot of them, it's like you're getting participation awards. You don't actually have to do anything and you still get an award. You don't have to clean your room. I mean, the things that I'm seeing people do, I have a friend of mine, for example, and she has this beautiful house and 3 kids, and she was like all stressed out about having to clean it because she's got a career and her husband's busy. And I'm like, you have 3 kids. Like, this shouldn't be a conversation. In my house, and when I was growing up, my brother said to my mom when she was going to teach him how to clean the house, and he said, "Boys don't clean the house." And she said, "Oh, honey, they do in this house."
Right.
Let me explain to you how it's going to go. And she was German, and so it was like very with excellence. So one other thing they installed is excellence, and so responsibility, taking responsibility. It's your room. Why do I need to pay you to clean your room? My parents just thought that was the most ridiculous thing. Look, you want us to teach you about money. That's different. But if you want me to pay you to clean your own room, which most of that stuff you were given as a gift, you didn't pay for it yourself. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so for them, they just said, no, take ownership. This is your stuff, your room, take care of it. You know what? You live here. You're going to help keep it clean. And some of these things are not being installed young. And then we're wondering why we have adults who don't want to take responsibility for their actions.
Yeah.
Because mom did everything for them.
Is there a through line? Because I feel like the modern parenting theory, and I'm learning about this, and I'm reading parenting books from the 70s and now parenting books from the 2000s and even more recent than that. Is maybe the through line here, when parents were convinced like, oh no, you don't have to be the authoritarian, you just need to be your kid's best friend, and kind of had the participation trophies and don't come down hard on them. Is there a chance that through line, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, is there a chance that that's the through line of where we have kind of lack of integrity in leaders right now? I don't know. Maybe I'm just making this in my head and connecting dots that aren't really there. But I feel like that post baby boomer generation was like, hey, we saw, our parents saw war, they saw horrible tragedy, then Vietnam, then, effectively a Great Depression and recession under Nixon and Carter. And it's like, well, now we just want to give them everything, and we want to be their best friends, and we want to spoil the kids because we had it pretty shitty. Do you think there's a through line to that, to now 30, 40 years later, we have a bunch of leaders, like Trump, who can't control himself and has to lash out on Twitter? I'm like, dude, you're the leader of the free fucking world. You made it. You made it. You are the most important person in the room. You do not have to insult anybody on Twitter to prove that you're the most important person in the world. And I'm just like, what is the through line here that we're here? And now we have the next leader, Biden, who he eats ice cream and takes a vacation while a country is falling apart. We have 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan. I'm just like, what is wrong with you people? Didn't your parents slap you once in a while? I don't know. I'm a horrible person, I guess.
No, I think, well, first of all, I don't know that slapping is necessary. I don't remember ever getting spanked or slapped, but I saw my brother do that, and he's older than me. And I was like, mental note to self, don't do that.
Yeah, be good.
Or at least don't get caught.
Yeah.
So that, I don't get that. But, and that only happened a couple of times he just drove but he was actually, it's funny because he had my dad's DNA. So he was exactly like my dad, and two of them could drive each other crazy.
Oh, I got from 5 years old to 17, I got hit, slapped, whatever, 3 times by my father. All 3 times, massively deserved it. So I was really pushing the bounds and actually trying to injure something or someone. And I got the wrath of my father. And I'm like, looking back, I'm like, all 3 times I deserved it. I've never hit my kids in anger. Maybe it will happen. Maybe it won't. I don't know. But that's another interesting discussion. But anyway, I think leadership.
Yeah, well, I think it does, in a sense, it ties in. It's not so much the physicality of it and doing that, because that can harm children, especially a lot of times when it's being done and kids don't know, and it's being done, where their parents are losing their mind and reacting. So the kids having this temper tantrum, and the parents reacting and having the temper tantrum, that never goes well. So and it can certainly harm the child, but the real thing is that, like, my parents actually didn't need to do that with me, because they instituted certain things and they explained why that was important. And so I think one of the things, like when we talk about, you asked about leaders now, and is it because of maybe what they were taught? I think there was a whole generation of parents who had it rough and who said, I want my kids to have it better than me. I don't want them to go through the struggles that I went through. I see that in business, in succession planning. I don't want my son to have to, or my daughter to have to go through the same hard things. So I'm going to promote them to, VP or give them the management role pretty quick, and they don't have to start off at the mail room or whatever the case is. The problem with that is that if they don't go through the same experiences as you, and I don't mean that they have to go all through exactly the same things, you can accelerate and fast track certain things and learn from your own experiences. But if you don't give them the opportunity to struggle and to learn and to recognize and experience failure, then they won't know they won't build those muscles and they won't know how to handle it later. If they don't learn to take responsibility for their own actions and the consequences of that, then they won't know how to do it. And so we have this whole generation and multiple generations, I think that were soft on their kids, where it's like, oh, well, I don't want him to have to do this. And again, it comes back to motive. I know someone who he said to his son wanted to make some money, and he said, hey, Dad, can I have an allowance? And my friends are getting allowances and so forth, or can I clean the house and get paid for it and all of that? And his dad said, no, I actually don't want you to learn that you make money from cleaning homes, but what I will do is I'll pay you to read professional development books, personal development books. I'll pay you to read some books because I want you to learn and make the association that you earn money from personal development. The more you learn, the more you grow and become a better person, the more you're going to make. I want you to make that association. And he did. Right. And his kid's amazing. And you underestimated how many books that kid could read, but but that's a different association. It's the motive, right? Behind it. So I think that there's a lot of, and it's hard, it's easy to say because I don't have kids and you say, oh yeah, but I was the kid, right? And I saw as we were helping others to launch their businesses alongside, so side businesses back in the day. And I saw that their kids didn't even know what they did for a living. And they didn't understand why they were going out in the evenings or spending that extra time trying to build a business on the side. They didn't comprehend it. When I look back at what my parents did with us, is they explained what they were doing, why they were doing it. They involved us in the process. So we got to learn in that safe environment some different principles, right? Various principles like responsibility, like teamwork, like integrity, being honest and loyalty and all those things. We got to learn those things in that safe environment so that when we grew up, I never had a curfew. I didn't need a curfew. Even when I was 16 and my cousin came from Holland, and Amsterdam loves to party. So we were out to 4:30 in the morning. We came home and my mother was up. And I was like, oh, sorry, and she said, no problem, just next time call. Yeah. But I knew, right? I knew it was like, that wasn't okay, right? But she was just like, just call. And so it was, a different form, rather than her screaming, yelling at me, right? And then me getting on the defensive and then all of that craziness, right? This is what we're seeing. It's just like, hey. So, but I never had a curfew, didn't need one because I was very responsible. I mean, I was running a business. I was doing their paperwork at 12, 13, 14 years old. I was doing paperwork for them. 19 years old, I was writing checks for $100,000 a week, not even thinking twice about it. And being very responsible for having, writing blank checks, if you will.
Yeah.
And, but it was because of all the things that they taught. And I think right now what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of, so that's one part. We're seeing a lot of people that didn't get that kind of experience or upbringing. You see single moms sometimes, some of the very, very successful people, and you look at their childhood and they had a single mom who was working really hard and they just worked together. They figured out, rather than just sitting back and saying, I want a new iPhone. Right. Oh, okay. Well, because they want to give them everything. Or maybe there's a lot of parents who felt bad for being away from their kids. So then they tried to buy them right? Try to give them stuff. We saw that a lot growing up. So people try to basically paying off their kids.
Yeah,
what do their kids learn to do is pay off people to get, to get on the good side. Then of course there's the other side of it, like I was saying earlier about greed and self-interest, and this self-centeredness and all of that, and wanting more and not enough. And so we see there's a lot of leaders that lack integrity. They're willing to go just a little bit, and it's really sneaky, because it's not like anybody, I think, decides, maybe some anomalies again, but for the most part, people don't decide to, let's say, get into politics. I'm going to get into politics and I'm going to be very deceitful, and I'm going to, blah, 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 and I'm going to manipulate people. That's not necessarily, people get in because they want to help people. They want to make a better difference or whatever it is. A lot of times it's just that 1 degree. It's that one decision, and that one decision leads to another decision, which leads to another decision and another decision. And now all of a sudden you're way off track and you don't even know how you got there. Right. But you have no idea where your integrity went. It's long gone. And it's easier to make those little decisions. And it's like the how do you eat an elephant 1 bite at a time? When you're flying a plane, and you're not, if they're actually planes, pilots don't drive, they don't fly in one exact direction, right? They're course correcting all the time. But if they're 1 degree off on the start and they don't make course correction, they're going to be miles and miles off by the time they get to their destination. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing people just slide off. And integrity is being whole and complete. It is being in integrity. Your word is your worth. Your worth is your word. And I learned that growing up, that it would be better for me to be less successful, but go to bed at night knowing that I did things honorably, than to have more success and sacrifice, sell my soul for the dollars. I also think one last thing I'll say is on this, and is I think that, and I am a Christian. I do believe in biblical principles, and they just work, and I know that human beings, nature, we have distorted it, and the church has gotten a lot of bad raps for being very hypocritical and all that stuff. But if you really look at the word, and I actually had the advantage, I guess, of, I looked for churches and I didn't relate to any of them. So I just read the Bible for myself. And I'm like, okay, what does this mean? And so in reading that, I could see the principles and the consequences of getting outside those principles, seeing story, because it's a book of stories. And you see the life, and humanity unfolding. And there's just certain principles that work. And it teaches, like, be slow to, quick to listen, slow to speak, right? Love. I mean, I don't know how difficult this is, but I mean, geez, it's like, love God, love one another as yourself. I mean, how hard can that possibly be, right?
Pretty hard right now.
Judge.
Apparently.
It is really hard right now. Or judge not lest you be judged, right? And a man divided against himself, or a nation divided against, among itself, will not stand, right? I mean, these are principles. They're whether you believe in God, Jesus, whatever, they just work. Right. They're just principles, laws of nature. And so it's embedding those laws of nature. If you didn't get it as a kid and you're an adult and you're finding yourself off track, the good news is you can get back on track, and start to get yourself. And the first thing would be to get yourself back into an integrity and start taking responsibility.
So you'll get a kick out of this, and we'll have to cut this into like a little clip or something.
How is that in a long-winded?
No, I
talk about being long-winded.
I love it, because you're just sparking so many, or you're sparking so many thoughts in my mind. And by the way, I mentioned before we went live that I was at the Guns N' Roses concert last night, drinking a little bit too much, so my mental acuity is not exactly there. So this is great.
You told me to take the lead.
I know, take the lead. You're sparking all my thoughts, but you'll really appreciate this, because I'm kind of agnostic. I think it would be ignorant for me to say there is no God or there is no correct religion, but I'm not a practicing member at church. I grew up Presbyterian, which is like the Diet Coke of Christianity. And so I was at a pretty high level personal business development seminar. And because I had some friends and I'm good at weaseling my way into the right circles, I got to go out to dinner with all the presenters the night after the event. And they were talking about all this new stuff and this new science. And I'm like, hey guys, I'm like, believe what you want, do what you want, but can we just accept the fact that all the stuff we just talked about over the last 2 days is effectively in the Bible? And they got a little angry, right? Because this was a very progressive crowd here in California. And I'm like, I turned to the one girl who was like the meditation specialist. I'm like, oh, spend 10 minutes a day in reflection and showing gratitude to yourself and thinking about the important things in your life. I'm like, oh, you mean like prayer? and then I turned to the guy that gave the business talk, and I'm like, all the stuff that you were talking about, Good to Great, the book Conscious Leadership, this idea that we now have scientific proof that businesses that do things with moral character actually succeed more than other Fortune 500 companies. I'm like, oh, you mean kind of like love your neighbor and tithing and whatnot? And then the one guy who gives this big keynote, which is amazing, by the way, he's one of my favorite people. He runs a great charitable organization. I was like, oh, giving back, like, tithing or taking care of your family. I mean, I just went down the line, and I'm like, all the modules we just did are effectively first principles in the Bible. They're reorganized into, pick whatever you want, Tony Robbins, Scientology, self-help, meditation, but it's all the same shit. Like, be good to people, give a little bit back, spend some time in reflection of gratitude. I'm like, that sounds a lot like religion to me, but these people were very anti-religion and they did not want to hear that. Actually, the one guy who runs the charitable company, he was kind of on my side, but everybody else was like, no, this isn't that crazy God walks on water. I'm like, yeah, but think about the faith that it takes for me to believe, like, well, if I just sit here in silence 10 minutes a day, my life will be better. Like, that's a faith-based statement. And yes, maybe you now have some science to back it up, but there's also science that prayer works. So it was pretty crazy. And I thought you'd get a kick out of that, considering that all this new leadership technology is really just going back to the first principles of like Western Judeo-Christian thoughts and beliefs.
Well, and if you look at any major religion, right, there's the golden rule filters through all. The language might be different, the stories and examples and so forth, but this principle of love your neighbor as yourself is pretty universal, and because it works. And yeah, there are principles that and it's actually a good thing. I see it as a good thing, not just because I believe in the Bible and so forth, but it's actually a good thing, because if we were just like, hey, this is a new idea, meditation, there would be no track record to really prove that it actually worked. We're like, well, we know it works. And in our little group, we know we've been doing it for 20 years or whatever works. But when you realize that people have been doing that for thousands of years and it still works, that just is more validation that the principle is literally a timeless principle. So yeah, it's funny. And you know what? Most of the time I find when I talk to people, if they're against God or they don't believe in all that, really it's the institution of church. Like, right. So as I said, when I became a Christian and I started looking for churches, I did not relate to any of them. I was like, I don't know. We were down at a conference down in the US. I lived in Canada at the time. So I come back to Canada and I'm like, this is not at all what I experienced down in the US. I don't know what's going on, but it's very empty and it's very just very shallow. It felt to me very shallow and very lackluster, lack of spirit, and some people, pious and holier than thou and all that. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm allergic to pretense. So I'm like, oh, that's a good one. Ladies in their big hats and so forth. I'm just like, yeah, how are you acting on Monday? That's what I really want to know. You tell me, bless you, my child. And I just think you're kind of full of it. So
okay, I'm getting that made into a bumper sticker, by the way. I'm allergic to pretense. That's such a great line.
Well, but that's the thing, is what most people are against when it comes to anything. If they're against it, it's oftentimes it's the man-made, it's like, I hate this or I hate that. It's like really their experience with it that didn't go well, if that makes sense. So with when you think about God, it's like, I've never had anybody say, I hung out with God for 2 days and can't stand the guy. Like, I mean, he's horrible. Like, that's not usually what happens. They're like, I went to church and this happened and blah, blah, blah. And they told me, and it's the experience. And that is all the man-made structure around religion. Right. And that's why a lot of time you hear a lot of the churches that are actually thriving right now, and especially even in the young generation, they're thriving, is that they're actually making the distinction between being a believer and being in a faith-filled world or church or in that space, versus religion, which can be limiting. It's like, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Jesus came, he was a rebel. You talk about rebels. Jesus was a rebel. He came and started turning tables over and telling the religious leaders they were, full of it, and that they were going to go, that they were a brood of snakes and so forth. They were not happy. They killed him for that, and why? Because he was going after that religious spirit, which was legalistic. And that's what people are against. And it's like, somebody once said, there's legalist. And I said, yeah, you know what? Jesus was against that too. That's why he showed up. And that's why he did what he did. So he's like, I'm in agreement with you. All that stuff, that hypocrisy that you learned in your church. Yes, I agree that shouldn't be that way. And so it breaks down the barriers, and it is a bit of a pattern interrupt too. We talk about Tony Robbins. I love Tony, and sometimes we need a little bit of pattern interrupt because we're thinking in a certain way, and somebody goes, "What about this?" My sister-in-law once said, "Oh, they want to teach creation and so forth, blah, 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 versus evolution." And she was kind of leaning towards the evolution versus the creation. And I said, "Oh, yeah. Yeah. So what if it was both? What if it was both? I'm not trying to convince you, right? But just think about it. Like, what if it was," she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "What if it was creation and then evolution? Have we evolved?" "Yeah, of course we've evolved." Right. But even the Big Bang, how did that come to be, right? And how many years did it take for the bang to unfold, right? So are we saying the same thing, similar? Like, is there a point of, again, coming back to that point of agreement, we start to see and saying, yeah, we might actually be saying the same thing, but then it veers off, of course, and we can go into the different theology from there. But, it's challenging people to, think differently. And I think you need to be willing to see the other person's point of view to make an effective argument. The guest that I had on my show last week, Yonason Goldson, he's a rabbi and he does other things, leadership consulting and so forth. And he is all about, he wrote a book called Grappling with the Gray, that ethics, ethical leadership and so forth. And we were talking about this, and he said, when they used to debate, what they would do is and even now, like what do lawyers do right now? If they want to debate, and they're going to court, they look at their point of view, their argument, and then they have to look at the other side's point of view and argument, and actually argue against their point of view to be able to see the full picture and to see if there's any holes in their argument. But most times right now, people don't even want to entertain that thought of the other side, because what will that mean to, maybe I'm wrong. Oh my God, I don't want to be wrong. If I'm wrong, what does that say about me? Right. And so they don't do that. And then you get people, like I say, in two camps that are yelling at each other. But if they were actually the flip sides, just for a moment, there's a difference between agreement and acknowledgement. I can acknowledge somebody's argument. I don't have to necessarily take it on and agree with it permanently, but it will give me a greater perspective on how is it possible that they could think that way?
Yeah.
Oh, because they watch CNN, or they watch this, or they watch that, they watch whatever, the Epoch News or whatever it is. Right. They're going to see it through the lens. Oh, wow. Okay. So now I can seek to understand when I seek to understand where they're coming from, it gives me a bigger picture, and it makes me more effective, even if I am still on this side saying this is this way. But now I actually have some basis to have a discussion with them, because I actually know where they're coming from and I can appreciate it.
That's really interesting, because one of the political arguments that I feel that I can have with people that are super charged on both sides of the debate, and I can stay super cool, calm, and collective and actually get some agreement or some consensus, is on abortion. And I won't talk about where I currently lie on the subject, but over my lifetime, I've gone back and forth, like my libertarian views, my scientific views, probably when I was younger, my religious views. Now, as I get older, having kids, those views. It's like I have gone probably every decade or so since I found out what abortion was in my young teens, like dramatically back and forth on the pro-life versus pro-choice. And so I've been forced for myself to look at both sides of the arguments because I've been strongly in each camp. And so now I feel like I can have an argument with, or a debate or a discussion about abortion with anybody, be like, totally see where you're coming from. And what if this, you know? But maybe you can give me some coaching here. Where I don't do well in that subject is like, and you can, I'll use this podcast to get some free leadership coaching. I have a very, 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 very long fuse and a giant explosion. And so, you know, when I get frustrated in business, it can go on like months, years, sometimes a decade. But then when it finally blows up, it's like, no, you're dead to me. I hate you. You're a horrible human being. You're completely wrong and whatnot. And so it's interesting because like, my first principles are actually to be pretty, I think, gracious and accommodating. But once somebody says something that cuts that off, I become not a good person, you know? And this has led to like some long-term friendships that no longer exist or long-term business relationships that no longer exist. And so being able to see things from the other point, if you're the type of person that has, like, you're like me, you have a longer fuse and a big explosion, like what's the coaching tip to like just not have that explosion, or in the real heat of that moment when you finally have reached your breaking point to be like, no, I can totally see this other person's side of the argument, right? Because sometimes I can after the fact, but during the heat of the moment, you know, the F word just ends up coming out of my mouth and I hang up on people and then I never talk to them again. So give me some coaching on how to see the other side of somebody's opinion in either leadership or business or politics, so we can just be a better version of ourselves.
Well, Marty Seligman did a study, and it was on positive psychology, and they did this research on, I think it was insurance brokers, and what they found was salespeople essentially. And what they found is that when there's high emotion, there's low intelligence. So we've all been in an argument, just like you just described, where we say things that afterwards we go, oh, I wish I wouldn't have said that. Hard to take those words back, whatever, right? Why did we do it? Because it was we were at high emotion, get wound up. And the study said it was like they were 34% lower on their intelligence, right? So you're losing all of that presence of mind to make a quality decision or response to it, right? So first of all, is when you notice your emotion getting, you know, kind of just winding up there, right? It's curbing it back. The real question comes in is, why is your emotion getting wound up? What is it saying about you? Because we are ultimately really selfish people. It is about us, right? We are the center of our universe.
Right.
And so when somebody is actually saying, like, what does it say? What is the meaning that you are talking about story? What is the meaning that you're making of it? If somebody gravely disagrees with you,
right,
and is like, you think they're completely an idiot. I don't know why they would ever do that, you know, or think that. What is it? What is the meaning that you are making out of it?
Yeah, it's usually when I get to a point where I feel personally insulted. You know, like somebody can insult me. Somebody can insult me professionally and be like, this, you know, I don't think you did a good job at this. You didn't do a good job at that. But when I feel personally insulted, like, oh, you're offending, just your personal first principles, right? Or your ethics or whatnot. Then I start to lose my mind.
So what we're talking about is that self-preservation, right? So like you said, you feel personally attacked. They take it personally. When we take things personally, and it's hard not to take things personally, but when you realize that, this comes back from the spiritual standpoint, you're a spiritual being having a human experience.
Yeah.
Right? So as a spiritual being, you cannot be, let's just argue, you can't be destroyed. So if I come from a place, I'm a spiritual being. Even if I leave this body, I'm still going to be somewhere. Right? I mean, like, if you want to go really deep with that, right? But ultimately, if I feel secure in myself and I feel secure in who I am and that I am, then you can say whatever you want about me. And I may be surprised. I might be disappointed. I might be hurt, but it doesn't actually affect my value. It doesn't affect I'm not going to die by what somebody else does or says or thinks. Now, when you start protracting that out and you start thinking, yeah, but if you make this decision and that's going to, like, of course, right now in the world, right? If this happens and that happens, I'm going to end up here and you're going to end up there and this is going to be bad and so forth. You go that route, right? Again, it comes back to self-preservation. But if I know that, and this is where my faith has become even more something that I talk about, is that my ability to be the calm in the midst of the storm comes from my faith in trusting that God is not surprised by any of this. And he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end. And he knows, whether you think about higher power or source, indestructible source, unchanging, has been for eons and eons, whatever. And I'm connected to God and I'm saying, God, lead me, which is really checking with my own spirit and saying, okay, how do I lead? How do I go through this minefield? Then I'm coming from a very different place, because I'm like, I'm solid. I'm secure in that. Right. And then I can look out and I can listen to what else is going on around the world, but I'm not scared. I'm not coming from a place of fear, a place of I'm going to die, worrying about self-preservation. If I worry about self-preservation, I'm going to make decisions that are self-centered. And that self-preservation is like every man for himself,
right? Kind
of kicks in, right? And in an argument, that doesn't go well, right? Because you have every man or woman for themselves, and then high emotion, low intelligence, and then 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, an hour, 2 days later, you're like, it wasn't that bad. Why did I say that? But the friendship's done. You've already done the damage. So you got to keep your emotion down. How do you do that? Is recognizing and saying, hey, this is not a statement of who I am. I would say it's like finding out who you are. And you get that it's like, I'm Scott, and no matter what you say, and no matter what you think, I'm who I am. In the Bible, it actually talks about when Moses asked, who are you? And God said, I am that I am. I am that I am. Tell them I am that I am. Well, we are made in God's, if we believe we're made in God's image, then I am that I am. I'm that baby. I'm just a grown up, but I'm that child that was born, that spirit that came into this world, that was born whole and complete, perfect, valuable, deserving of human rights and all of that. I'm still that person. It's like the example of there was a speaker once. He took a $20 bill and he said, how much is this? $20. Okay, great. And then he stepped on it and he spit on it and did all this. And he says, how much is it worth? And they're like, it's still worth $20, right? You're still worth what you're worth, no matter what anybody else does. And it just gives you a sense of, it's like, okay, I think you're an idiot. I think you're this. I think you're that. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Because it's all out there. It's not in here. When I take it personally, though, now I've got to protect myself and survive the fight.
Yeah. One of the big words you said in there, which I think that was a beautiful explanation, was insecurity. And, do you feel secure about yourself, or are you insecure? And I think when I've seen people, and reflected on myself, of people really getting, triggered is one of the new favorite words in the media, or really getting angry and lashing out, it's either because, maybe the person that was insulting you or debating with you or arguing with you, it hit a nerve because it was so close to being true, or it hit a nerve because it was so close to being false, And the funny thing is, when somebody calls me out for something that's true, I think I do a fair amount of self-reflection. I'm like, yeah, you got me. Like, I wasn't actually committed to that or whatever. And I can kind of laugh it off. But when I feel like I'm being insulted and I'm now feeling insecure because they're identifying something that is so not who I am, that's when I get mad and I just want to like lash out and go crazy, because like it's that insecurity and maybe I'm not as secure with what I know about myself that I then lash out on them. Like one of the favorite talking points right now, if you get into a debate with anybody on social media or in the public zeitgeist, it's like, oh, well, you're just a racist. And I know in my heart of hearts that I am not a racist. And that is so unequivocally false that I lash out and then I scream at people and they say, see, that's proof that you're a racist, because you didn't want people to not burn down Target or whatever I'm debating against. Right. And it's crazy because it must be just that, like, I hate to get too deep here, but that, something happened when I was a kid, I'm insecure about this, or I have some insecurity around that. And then when somebody hits that nerve, oh God help them, because I lose my shit. And a lot of times it's just end in like very poor outcomes with people who maybe I still want to be friends with. So my takeaways were high emotion equals very low intelligence. So maybe just removing myself from the situation or finding a way to get secure with myself in those insecure moments and not lash out at the person who's either hitting a nerve because it's very close to being true or so patently false that, no, I just got to be secure with who I am. And
take a few deep breaths before you respond.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when you take those deep breaths, you actually are getting oxygen to your brain, right? When you think about somebody who's in fight mode, what happens? They stop breathing and they're like, oh, right? The adrenaline starts to flow and all that kind of stuff. Here, if you just take a few deep breaths before you actually respond and you think and check in, you ground yourself, all that meditation stuff you were talking about earlier, like you just can ground yourself in 2 seconds. You can just and I appreciate you're saying that. And in teaching sales, there's 2 ways to handle any objection. And it applies here too. Acknowledge, ask a question. And if you want to add a third piece to that, it's really checking in the emotion, right? This is an emotional objection or is this an intellectual objection? I don't understand what you actually just said. Or is this, I hate you, or I hate your I hate what you just said, or I'm angry with what you just said, or I'm afraid, or whatever it is. But ultimately you're acknowledging, well, thank you for sharing that, right? I acknowledge you for what you just said because it's true for them in that moment. How ridiculous it is, it's still true for them in that moment. And then you can ask a clarifying question. And when you ask a clarifying question, you can dig deeper and you're actually putting it back on them. Hey, somebody throws you a hot potato. It doesn't mean you have to hold on to it. Give it back to them. Go tell me more about that. Why do you feel that way?
Right.
And then what that does is that actually gives you a chance to take a few deep breaths, to reground and to remind yourself that this is not to take this personally. This is not about you. When people object, even if they say you have no idea what you're talking about, or I hate you, it's actually not. A lot of that is projection. And to your point, yeah, maybe it's some inner child stuff that happened a long time ago. And oftentimes in my coaching, even though I might talk about business, a lot of it, we get into this stuff because that's the stuff that's holding people back from the breakthroughs. But yeah, that's one thing you can do in that moment. There was something else that you said there and I forgot what it was.
I think just the insecurity, just addressing that insecurity and being secure about what I know to be true about myself and what I believe.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So if I tell you, so you're pretty secure in your manhood.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all gender arguments aside right now, you know that you're a guy, you're a man.
Right.
Okay.
Feel very
If I argue and tell you and say, Scott, you're a woman and your name is Mary, you're going to be like, last I checked, that's not the case.
I literally have to pee right now. And I'm pretty sure that I'm a man based on the sensation I'm having in my body.
We'll have to wrap this up. But the thing is that when somebody mentioned about somebody saying something that is so false, that when it's that ridiculous and it's that false, let's say, that it's like you get to that, when you know who you are. I know that I'm a man. Last I checked, and even if I check in right now, I am. Then it doesn't matter. You can argue. Somebody can argue all day long that you're a woman. You're like, I know I'm not. So this conversation's over. I don't know what else to tell you. That, it's when there is a little bit, and you mentioned about a little bit of truth. There's a little bit of something there, or it's grating on a it's triggering you from something that happened in the past. And I said, coming back to that primary lie of the not enoughness and whatever that looks like. I'm insignificant. I'm unlovable. I'm not smart enough, not tall enough, not good enough, not whatever, right? Not successful enough. My dad didn't, accept me, whatever it is, right? Though there's lots of things, unlimited amount of things, right? That could go on, but it's triggering something. And then it's checking in and saying, okay, well, what does that remind me of? Because it's not this that's upsetting me. If it's so ridiculous, it's really, that's not what's most of the time. People are so triggered right now. People running off and grabbing toilet paper last year and so forth. I'm like, what's the toilet paper? Right? They're so triggered by something and reacting. And of course, there was that herd mentality too, right? A couple of shelves were empty and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, right? Self-preservation kicks in. But there's so much triggering happening with COVID, the whole pandemic and everything going on with it, that it's bringing up all this stuff. Now there's an opportunity there. And that's where the gift is, coming to what we were talking about, loss, gain, is what are you focusing on? Is there's an opportunity there. So when I get triggered, I go, what's that about? So now it just takes me out. Like, I'm not upset with this person anymore. Now I'm going, that's interesting. What's up with that? Why are you getting upset because somebody's blocking you on the highway, or somebody's saying something ridiculous on social media? It poked a wound somewhere in you. So what's that? And then when you can deal with that, and you keep dealing with all those little triggers, you don't get triggered anymore, because all those switches that were there and people just flicking the switch are no longer, you just render them ineffective, if you will. So when I was married, my first time around with my husband, then I said he came back, but that first time around, he told me, like, you're not good enough, you're not this, you're not that. And he was telling me all this stuff. And initially I took it really, really personal. Like, maybe I'm not enough, because what it was like proving to me that all the things that I feared, that I thought I had dealt with. And now there's somebody that's the closest person to me saying that I'm not enough and all this stuff. So I started doing a lot of work and hired coaches and so forth, and I worked through that. And I took ownership, responsibility, that there were certain things that maybe I could have done better in the relationship, or that I could have seen earlier on, right? In terms of red flags or different things that I need to be aware of in terms of his behavior. But just taking ownership of my contribution to this crazy that we were in. Okay. But then I got to the point where I'm like, okay, I've dealt with a lot of my stuff. The rest's on you. And what I started to realize is, because it takes two to tango, right? I started to realize, yeah, I can still continue to work on me. But the fact that you're telling me now, I get that I am enough, and I'm the self-acceptance and the love for myself and forgiveness for the mistakes in the past or the things that I had done, even current, I've got processed that. Now I can take an honest look at the situation and say, okay, this is actually you not feeling good about you. And so you're trying to project on me to just deflect from the fact that you actually don't feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So now I can have compassion for you, because now I see what you're doing, because you're doing the same thing I just did, but like in a bigger way, right? Because we naturally do that. And so I started to have compassion for him, and I stopped taking it personally, and what freedom there was in that. And so, being able to support him through that. And even though we didn't end up staying together, and I'm like, hey man, I love you. I believe in you. I know that you're amazing. What you're doing doesn't work for me.
Right.
And that's not going to work. But I'm separating the two out. I'm not making you the bad, right, thing. I'm separating and saying, I believe and I see you as God sees you, as like, you're an amazing human. Deep down inside, there's a great person in there. But who you're choosing to be and how you're choosing to act doesn't work. And so I can be soft on the person, hard on the issue, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And there's just, as I say, there's just freedom in that. And you don't, now it's like, if you've had people personally attack you, after a while, you're like, it's like when you handle enough objections in sales, they don't bother you anymore. And the funny thing is that you get to the point where you know how to handle them, right? And you're like, okay, give me that one because I know how to handle that one.
You kind of look
it doesn't
forward to
come
it.
up. It doesn't come up anymore. You're like, where is the person who told me this? Because I am ready for it now.
Right.
And it doesn't show up because you've learned the lesson and you get to move on. It's like a video game, right? You get to move on to the next level.
Yeah. I've got a question. You're just sparking all these thoughts and questions in me. It would be great if everybody got leadership training early in life, but they don't. And it would be great if leaders were perfect, but they aren't. And looking at, our current void of leadership across the spectrum in America, what advice would you give to leaders if they're trying to reestablish trust, right? And it's very convenient in the libertarian, more conservative circles I run in to throw Fauci under the bus. But if we're giving him the most, genuine interpretation of what he was doing and the science was evolving. Let's say you're a leader like Fauci or Biden or Trump or the CEO of a company that gets caught in scandal, or Bezos who's out cheating on his wife or whatever. How can leaders authentically reestablish trust after they've screwed up, right? Because I don't know. I barely graduated high school, right? I'm not a virologist. So it's like Fauci says wear a mask, and he says don't wear a mask, and he says wear a mask. It's like, dude, I don't know which one's right. I don't know what the science is, or I don't know what the counterfactual is. We can't prove what happened. But at the end of the day, right now, you're supposed to be the guy that knows whether or not wearing masks makes sense. Now I just don't trust you. Right. And now, sadly, everything that comes out of your mouth, I just don't trust you. And it's, the same thing in a marriage. Somebody cheats on you and it's like, now I just don't trust you. Like you said, soft on the person. I get it. Maybe the other person in the relationship had some culpability here on why you cheated, but I'm pretty hard on the issue. And now I just don't have any trust. So if we're looking at leaders for a corporation, for the leader of the World Health Organization or a political party or whatever, how can leaders start to reestablish trust when they screw up in that marriage, that relationship, that business, that political form? Like what do leaders have to do after they screw the pooch?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, they got to acknowledge it. And there's a term I'll use, which is not a popular term, but it is a term, it's a scriptural term, repent. Repentance isn't just saying, yeah, I did that thing, but it's actually feeling the remorse about it and saying, man, you know what? I screwed up. And being honest about it, or saying, hey, man, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Being authentic, that to me is being authentic, is being real, not trying to sugarcoat it. What creates more distrust is sweeping it under the carpet. And a lot of times people don't trust others because there's no remorse, there's no repentance, there's no change of behavior.
Right.
So what would make me believe that anything's changed here? And so that's the first thing. Second thing is that it's all part of this, is you got to get back into integrity. They need to get back into integrity with himself, right? Because odds are, if they're distrusting, if they're just not trustworthy, I should say, if they're not trustworthy, somewhere along the way, they're out of integrity, right? They're out of integrity with their words and their actions. Or like you said, Fauci, I mean, it's this, it's that, like, which is it? Like, right. Just work it out. What is it? And then decide and stick with that. Find the truth, and then there's got to be a change of behavior. I'll tell you a quick story I actually read it in a book, and the book is called Unpunishable. It's a Christian book written by Danny Silk. And he uses this example, and it's really fascinating because in this book, this is up from Bethel and Redding, California, big church. And there was a guy, and he named it in the book. He named the guy. So, and I was like, wait a second, I was up there and I remember him, like, that's a real person. And he's telling the story of Ben Armstrong. And he was a leader, a pastor, and he was unfaithful to his wife. And he had them both in his office and was like, what are we going to do? Right. So what happened is, in short, is that Ben was willing to repent. There was a remorsefulness. There was a commitment to change behavior. And then obviously there were still consequences though. He was a pastor, he was leading the school of ministry, and all the students that were hurt, from finding this out and so forth, everybody knew about it, right? He had to go and clean up his mess with each one of those people and have conversations, which now obviously Fauci's not going to have a conversation with everybody. He's going to have it publicly or whatever, whoever it is we're talking about, you used him as an example, needs to come clean and clear up the relationships, any hurt, any concerns and so forth, and maybe recommitments to what you're going to do about it. That's what he did. Took a while to do it, a couple of years or whatever. He watched so Danny, who was mentoring him and he was consulting, he would check to test, right? So you say you're going to do this, you say that you're repentant, you're going to do all these, you're going to do things differently. Let's see over time, right? So there was a new pattern of behavior. There was new demonstrations. There was, just the fact of being honest and saying, look, I screwed up. I think with Clinton, for example, one of the things that really, with him and Monica Lewinsky back in the day, right? The thing that really got me was, like, he's lying to millions of people on camera. And even I was in Canada at the time, and people said, well, just because he's, did that thing, whatever, and doesn't make him a bad president. I'm like, actually, that's not the issue. To me, the issue is if he can lie to the camera and lie to millions of people, what else is he lying about?
Right.
And that's where you don't be able to, you can't build that trust. But had he come out and say, look, I did this thing. I'm really sorry. I'm sorry that's impacted, blah, 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 and so forth. We might have thought a little, at least I would have looked at it a little bit different.
Yeah. It wasn't the crime. It's always the cover up, right?
It's the cover up, and it's the not acknowledging, comes back to that responsibility and integrity. You're never going to be able to get past that. Right.
Yeah.
And we see that. Do people screw up all the time? Do we screw up all the time? We're human beings. We're not perfect. We're far from it. Right. And so we're going to screw up. Leaders of businesses, they're going to screw up. Well, there's got to be consequences. That's why with Ben Armstrong, yeah. Was he removed from his position? Of course he was. Right. Because he fooled around with a student that was staying at their home and billeting in their home. Not okay.
Big problem.
Right? Yeah. So he was like, okay, well, he's not safe, right, to have around the students because there's a risk there. So, but what I honored is the fact that obviously his name is in the book and it's a real person. And so he is that honest and willing to say, here, this is how I screwed up. And now he's on the other side. And I was there, and he was like, very involved in ministry again and so forth. This happened years ago. Right. But how was he able to build that trust is by the honesty and coming forward and saying, hey, this is what I did. I'm really sorry. I'm going to own the consequences, and I'm going to commit to doing things differently. Transformation is awareness, choice, and then there's the follow through, the actual execution of that choice. And so acknowledging, making a choice and commitment, and then doing something, and demonstrating through your actions that you're actually following through with that. And so leaders that, business leaders that screw up, hey, you know what? And some people may never trust you.
Right.
They may never trust you, but you'll have a better chance of people starting to trust you when you do that. And there are going to be some people that will never trust you. And that's because they're triggered now. So that's where you've done your part. Now they may still not trust you, but that's their triggers from their experience where they're afraid because somebody else said, trust me, I've changed and didn't. And so that's all their stuff going on. But all you can do is do the best you can be, do the best you can do, and be the best that you can be.
As you're using those words, authentic, repentance, atoning kind of for the sins, I'll tell you where my fears are. And I feel these are the kind of prototypes that are being laid out on the left and the right. I think on the left, they've moved more and more, and I'll just say the left, politically, socially, whatever. This is not necessarily Democrats versus Republicans, but we'll just say people that are more left leaning, more progressive leaning, they've carved out this narrative for themselves of like, well, it's all moral relativism and it's my truth. It's not really right or wrong. And what that does is that really absolves anybody from ever saying they screwed up or repenting, because they're like, well, no, that's my truth. Cheating was just my truth. It was, just giving into my natural instincts. Right. So there's no longer any social norm about what's right or wrong. You mentioned the not to offend anybody's gender feeling, but now it's like it's socially unacceptable in many circles to say that there's a difference between a man and a woman. I mean, it's crazy because it's this moral relativism, my truth, which I don't even think that can even be possible, because by stating that, you actually are saying that there is a right and a wrong. But anyway, I digress. And then my fear on the right conservative side of people, presidents, politicians, if you lean left, if you lean more right, is like, well, why would I ever apologize? Why would I ever do that? And that's what we saw in Trump, where he's like, it doesn't matter. The indictment's already been made. The statement's already been made. If I make an apology, you're just going to use that as, validation of whatever you're indicting me for, being a sexist, being a this, being that, whatever term you want to throw in. So like the new conservative slant is like, well, fuck you. I'm just never going to apologize. I'm never going to atone for anything because it doesn't do me any good anyway. Right. So it's like, that's a really dangerous dichotomy we're setting up in the country. If one, people can't give an authentic apology because either they don't care or they think it'll be used against them. So that means they never atone, they never repent. And we just continue to go on with like, everybody just gaslighting us, being like, no, I didn't say that. And I'm like, no, I literally have a video of you 6 weeks ago saying that very thing. And they're like, oh, I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm just going to continue to lie and not say it. And I'm like, whoa, talk about adding to the leadership crisis in the country. Like those two 100%. Dilemmas. I mean, you start talking about end of days, forget about right versus left or white versus black or anything, but you start talking about a place where like both parties feel that it's never acceptable to have a moralistic right or wrong or apologize for it. It's like, well, that's the end of Rome, folks. And I don't know, maybe I'm just a grumpy old man.
The system's broken. I mean, definitely the system's broken. Even as I was describing and I was imagining Fauci, I'm like, Fauci would never do that, right? Like, so
right.
He's not going to, because, and politicians won't, because the other person is going to put them under the bus. Right.
Right.
So the book, that book, Unpunishable, actually talks about, we are in a punishing environment. We are in a punishing world. We punish others and we believe they deserve to be punished. And therefore we also believe that we deserve to be punished. And that sets up the self-preservation of, the survival mode, if you will. Right. So it's a really interesting take on that. And it's a deep book, but it's an interesting take on, I've never heard anybody describe it quite like that. But so if he, like this pastor who did this, if he was in pretty much any other church, the average church, he would have been fired. He would have been ostracized. Right. Right. They would have never trusted him. He probably would have never been able to pastor anywhere ever again. And they would have missed out on all of the skills and the gifting that he has for that role, right? And the impact that he's made, a huge impact, right? So we tend to punish people. So so the problem with it is you've got to create the environment, or be in an environment where you can, let's say as a CEO of a company, some people are not going to trust you ever and they're going to quit. Yeah, but you might win some back. The thing with politics, and you talked about moral relativism and the my truth kind of concept, right? That my truth is funny, because if you have a truth and I have a truth and it's just my truth, right? There's no my truth, your truth. Like you said, it lets us off the hook. There is the truth. So what about we get to the truth, right? And there are laws of nature. Forget the Bible. There's laws of nature. I can have my truth and say, I can jump off this building. And my truth is that I'm going to be able to fly.
Right. The ground would disagree. It's not the falling.
It's just, well, and it's not going to go well. And so we can argue that it's my truth, your truth. And it's like, well, but it just is, And so that's what I think we need to get back to. And we're so busy. I find a lot of the conversation, most of the conversation that's out there is is all talking about these things, which none of that stuff, it's kind of like at the top surface of the ocean, if you will, and it's all the waves and everybody gets distracted by those waves and everything. But underneath there is a stillness, there's a groundedness, there's the truth, right? There's principles that, like we were talking about earlier, that work, that have been working for eons, like, hello, it's just gravity just is, and if we just stop trying to, stay up here and try to solve issues up here and we get to the core of it, I think we'll be a lot better off. And the system is broken. It does need an overhaul. What that's going to look like, I don't know. But we definitely need an overhaul, because the path that we're on right now and in politics and all this, it's just not, it's not going well. And that's why for me, I started to get a lot more vocal and talking more about leadership. Like when I started my podcast, people would say, oh, this is a leadership podcast. I'm like, no, it's about transformation, because I'm all about transformation and transforming the way people see themselves, others, and the world around them. Well, isn't that leadership? Isn't that about, building better leaders? And so when I realized, okay, so somehow I've been resisting this idea of talking about leadership, but it really is about that. And so that's why now I started to focus more and more on that and saying, you know what, we have a leadership crisis. We need to change. If we can start turning a couple of these cards over, and there are some cards, they're a card, but turning some of these cards over, we can start flipping that. And maybe we have a chance to create a better world for everyone, if you will.
Right.
But we've got to get beyond all of what we've been talking about today, all the self-preservation and the survival and the not enough, all those conversations going on up there. And you're right, not, I'm right, you're wrong, and all that stuff, high emotion, low intelligence, and start looking at what actually works and what doesn't work. This doesn't work. This is leading to wars. This, how we've been doing it so far, however that is, what are the sides you're on, this has been leading us and got us to where we are. If we want to be somewhere different, we need to make some changes.
Right.
And then it's a question of what those changes are. And the changes is not like, you're an idiot and I know what I'm talking about, and then just keep increasing the chasm. That's not worked. Has never worked, really, when you think about it. So we've got to figure out another way to do this. And I think it starts with leadership.
And first, before I forget, what's the name of your podcast?
Leaders of Transformation.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then, we've been really good over the last 90 minutes or so, tackling the problems and outlining some of the things that are wrong. What's the thing or things out there that you're hopeful for? Like, what's the silver lining where Nicole can sleep at night and be like, you know what, we're moving in the right direction as a country, as a society, with leaders, because I see a bright spot here. So let's end on a positive note.
Oh, I like that. Okay. So yes, because that is actually what I like to focus on, and it keeps me sleeping at night for sure, is, what there is what the media is telling us that everybody thinks. And then there is the silent majority, if you will, that we're minority, but it's a good size group of people that are good people and that want they're not racists, and they love each other, and they're kind to each other, not perfect, but they're kind to each other. So what I have hope for is that there's enough people in this world that may not get the news, front stage on the news, but that are actually doing some pretty amazing things. Like I think about the people that I've had on my podcast that are out there in their communities, small or large, and they're doing their thing, and they're making a difference. They're making a positive impact. They're healing, hearts, and they're helping restore relationships and restore hope and give practical, advice on growing a business and helping people to be the best that they can be. And there's a lot of that going on. Mainstream media won't tell you that, but there is a lot of that going on. And that is encouraging to me. And I also think the other thing is encouraging to me when I come down to who we are, the I am that I am, is that I believe we're made in God's image. God is love. God is pure potential. And, when we think of if I'm made in God's image, And we're all meeting guys. We're spirit beings having a human experience. When we can strip away all that garbage, if we can strip away all the lies, all the deception and the fear and the scarcity that's loaded on people, is that underneath there's people that are very loving. You saw it in New York, 9/11. We've seen it at different times where maybe there's a hurricane or something going, that has happened, and people rally together and they set aside their differences and work together. And we by nature, when we set aside those things, we actually are really good people, and for the most part,
Right.
and we realize what's most important is like, hey, let's help each other out and we all win together. And so that's encouraging to me. And the more that I hear about what people are doing, the more encouraged I get. And, I can throw in there too, being a Christian, a believer, and saying, well, I know how the story ends. So God
Right.
wins. It's all good.
Right.
There might be a lot of evil in the world, but ultimately, whenever you watch a movie, right? I mean, who wins? Does the evil win? That usually sucks. Movies that, but it's usually good wins ultimately. And sometimes it comes right down to the wire. But when it comes right down to it, I believe the good in us will win if we allow it to, and if we create an environment for that good to thrive.
Cool, man.
And that's why there's a few of us out there that, a lot of us out there that are trying to create the environments for that to happen.
That's a really good spot to end. I like ending on some positivity, Nicole, because I have a tendency to just focus on the negative and all the things that are going wrong. So I appreciate you bringing it full circle. And I feel like we didn't even scratch the surface. I was taking notes as we were talking. I feel like I got like 10 other talking points that we could go on for 2 hours, but hopefully we can have you on again, maybe in the next couple months or so, to talk a little bit more about, leadership and the work that you do with actual, CEOs and things of that nature. Because I would love to dive into that more. And I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, even though I couldn't remember the name, so I apologize. And I do highly recommend, if you're in a leadership role or you're looking to grow as a leader, to go check it out, because the quality of some of the people that you've interviewed, as I was scrolling through your couple hundred podcast episodes, I might be asking for some introductions. So congratulations on all this success there, and we hope to have you back on.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. And thank you. It's been a pleasure and love the conversation. And yeah, I'm glad we ended on a good note too, though. It's encouraging.
Awesome. All right. And you know what? We're running a live event actually for some of our coaching clients down in San Diego in a couple months. So I know you relocated down there, and maybe we'll have you swing by and jump on stage and talk about leadership for a few minutes.
That'd be fun.
All
yeah,
right.
Let me know.
I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.